Okay, so this lecture is going to talk about something that I think is actually pretty fun, pretty cool to talk about, and that is competition. So we're going to go through a few different things. One is intraspecific competition. Intra means within, so you're looking at within a species the competition that occurs there and the modes of intraspecific competition. We'll look at competitive exclusion and niches, and then mathematical and laboratory models, which include the Lotka-Volterra model. Then we'll look at character displacement as it relates to competition and niches. So there are some modes of competition. One might be interference, and this is aggression between individuals. So you have, two hyenas here. One is being aggressive toward the other, but doesn't have necessarily a large impact on their everyday survival. So it's kind of a minor mode of competition. Then you have intraspecific, again, between members of the own species. So here you have two lions which are fighting over access to mating. So there's some competition there. And interspecific, competition between individuals of different species. So we have hyenas and lions here probably competing for some sort of prey that was killed. Okay, so one way in which intraspecific competition has been shown has been in plants. It's found that as plants increase in their growth, they decrease in their density. Okay, so the more plants, the bigger a plant is, the less and less of them there are. So you may have many seeds in the spring, lots of seedlings, but towards the end of the season, some of those seedlings grow and get a bit larger and larger, but they outcompete the other ones. So this can be referred to as the self-thinning rule, which is competition more intense at higher population densities. So if competition is higher, then you will have a lower number of individuals. So you can see this on this graph. We have biomass on one side, biomass being the total amount of mass of all the species in an area. And then here we have the number of individuals. So if you have a low number of individuals, over time as things grow, they will have a large biomass, but there will be much less of them. And here, if you have a high number of individuals, so these are all those seedlings, you have lots of them, may even be higher than usual. Over time, they will outcompete each other, and there will be less and less of them, but they will increase in biomass. So competitive exclusion is the ability of competition to kind of get at or resolve competitions to where there's only one species. So two species with identical niches cannot exist indefinitely in the same time in the same place. One will be a better competitor than the other and thus have a competitive advantage and greater fitness, and eventually exclude the other one from that time and place. It may move on to a different time and place, which is what has happened with different warblers which inhabit different parts of the tree. Some sort of competition event has forced these different species to inhabit different parts and utilize different resources. So one example of this is with Darwin's finches. So Grant was the researcher. He looked at differences in beak size, and he found that they could be attributed to diet, specifically the size of the seeds, which were correlated with the depth of the beak. In 1977, there was a drought. Lots of seeds were not produced that year, and the remaining seeds were very hard. So the species that had the thicker bills were able to survive the drought better than those that fed on the smaller seeds. So one way to look at competition between species is through this Lotka-Volterra model. It shows the effect of interspecific, so between two different species, competition and the growth of each of those species in effect of those competitions. So the equations are really just a slight modification from our logistic growth model. So we have a carrying capacity, but we include alpha 1, 2, and then also for the other one we have alpha 2, 1. So alpha is a representation of the effect of individual species 2 on the rate of population growth of species 1. So how species 2 affects species 1, and then the other one is the opposite. Okay, when they are in the presence of each other, what does that do to their population size? Okay, and in general, Lotka-Volterra predicts the coexistence of two species when for each of those two species intraspecific competition is greater than interspecific competition. Because if interspecific competition is too great, then one will outcompete the other. But if it's minimalized by intraspecific competition, there is some room there for overlap in their niche use. So Lotka-Volterra models predict population growth for two species will stop when you have zero growth isoclines. Okay, so when N1 equals the effect, the carrying capacity of species 2 on species 1 on population 2, and the opposite as well. So they will find some area in which they will both be in equilibrium. Okay, so you have some of these are all Lotka-Volterra kind of models. In this model, one species, depending on where you start, will outcompete the other. Okay, same thing for this one. Species 2 wins, and this one species 1 ends. Same thing with this one. If they're pointed towards each direction, we'll go over these more detail in class. But as here, eventually 1 or species 2 wins, depending on which side you are on, the carrying capacity. But on this one, you have a convergence on one point. Okay, and at this point, their carrying capacities equal the effects of each other. Okay, so this is only possible when the isocline crosses, and they're going in the right direction. So we'll go over these in class. So there are some experiments which have shown some effects of competition, including paramecia lab experiments. So paramecium are protists, and Gauss demonstrated that resource limitation with paramecium caudatum and paramecium aurelia in the presence of two different concentrations of bacteria that they would eat. Okay, so when they were grown alone, the carrying capacity determined their intraspecific competition. So this would be an example of the logistic growth model. But when grown together, P. caudatum quickly declined. So it couldn't keep up with the competition of paramecium aurelia. Okay, so if the growth medium was, this was the original, when the growth medium was high, that was what determined the carrying capacity, or how many lived. Alright, so competition can restrict species to their realized niches. So there's fundamental niches where they have overlap, but then competition will reduce them down to a realized niche. So sometimes, though, if they're strong and pervasive enough, they may produce an evolutionary response in their competitors. So it may change the fundamental niche. So you may have a niche overlap between panda bears and raccoons, right, in their region here. Well, this may cause raccoons to change their niche to use different resources. Okay. Connell discovered interspecific competition in barnacles. Balanis plays a role in determining the lower limit of thalamus within the intertidal zone. We talked about this before, right? You have different barnacles living in different areas. If you remove one of them, you can see the fundamental niche is higher. But it didn't account for all of the observed patterns. Okay, so there's some other experiments which were done. So Brown studied competition among rodents in Chihuahuan deserts, the Chihuahuan Desert. He predicted that if you had three different types of species, one, these large, very competitive granivorous rodents, and one small granivorous rodent, this one would be more competitive. And so if you removed them, the fundamental niche of the smaller one would increase. And then he had insectivorous rodents, which did not have a niche overlap in their food use, and he predicted they would not be affected by removal of that species. And what he found was exactly that. So Dipodomyces is the large, competitive, granivorous rodent. In normal populations, it's very dominant, and these small ones were near zero. Okay, then he removed the Dipodomys species, and in response you had small granivores increasing in the population. Okay, so there was some evidence of competition. But when you looked at the insectivorous ones, they did not respond. They had no response to an increase or decrease. Alright, so finally, character displacement occurs when you have the degree of competition with two species that have niche overlap. So interspecific competition will lead to directional selection for the reduced niche overlap. So here we have two species of finches with different beak depths, and you can find this one species on this map and this other species, on this island, and the other species on a different island, and their beak depths overlap when you look at those two. But when you look at an island where you find both species, there is no overlap. So this is character displacement. Alright, so that's it for competition.